Nice.
How about that? A little goodwill to start the episode.
Tis the season.
Tis the season. And can you tell I'm shooting in 4K?
No.
Okay.
No.
I got a new webcam for Christmas. I'm using
nice.
Antushka,
Hey, get up and move. Show us its capabilities.
So it's the ObSpot. It supposedly has AI, tracking capabilities, but I'm not sure how it works with Zoom. Anyway, I'll figure this out later. I'm just using it,
Let's get to the bottom of it. Let's actually do that. The podcast will be how to use this camera.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah.
This will be potentially useful if we decide to start live streaming the podcast.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Before you get too deep, I just want to
Sure.
say that on your last episode, I think you guys really missed it.
Uh-oh. What did we miss?
So the way to build up your podcast is not just through subscriptions, but leveraging that revenue into entrenchment with the government.
Yes, that's true.
Which I know is Antushka's dream. So
Yeah.
It's a good point, actually, that I think is worth emphasizing. We do need some sort of like Mussolini fascism,
Yeah.
a corporate state merge.
With the podcast.
With the podcast.
With the
yeah.
podcast, yeah.
I feel like it's a little Metalocalypse-esque, because wasn't the whole premise of that show that they had the fourth largest economy in the world or something like that?
It was something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
I forgot about that. Oh, that's a great show.
I never
Are they
saw
still
it.
making episodes? Oh, Mark. I mean, Brother
think
X.
Right. Yeah, you keep calling him the wrong name. It's rude
I
to call your
know.
guest by the wrong name.
It is.
Just don't call me Mr. T.
So we're picking back up with The Social Transformation of American Medicine by Paul Starr, right? And we read second part of chapter 3. I also read chapter 4, but, I'll just throw in little tidbits here and there about it.
I focused more on chapter 4 also.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh,
But
wow.
yeah.
I stopped at chapter 4.
Okay, good.
That's okay. That's fine. I had said at minimum to do, finish chapter 3 because it's like 30 pages.
You said at minimum?
Or yes.
All right.
Yeah.
I heard maximum.
Yeah, don't you dare even look at chapter 4.
All right. Well,
Cool.
Anyway.
I mean,
I'll
chapter
contribute what
4.
I can.
Chapter 4, I think, sort of mirrors chapter 3. It just adds the element.
Yeah.
It's focusing on the hospital. But
Right.
it's still talking about a lot of the similar things. So,
Sure.
and
All right.
I wanted to. Oh yeah, sorry. Go. No, take it, please.
No. I was just. I was saying where did we leave off? Where was the delineation last week for picking up with a summary? Kind of?
Medical education. Oh, in terms of like what we discussed. I mean, summary. I would say is that the AMA was instrumental in creating a professional class, the professionalization of medicine, the American Medical Association, and let's see, a big thing that allowed this to happen was as the AMA, they started to sort of make state chapters, and they set sort of ethical guidelines that, got people to follow. And then this sort of started to create a camaraderie between people. And then it also became kind of like, you wouldn't really be a respected physician if you weren't associated with the AMA. And then they started charging dues, and this allowed them to, build up money and start lobbying Congress and things to get laws changed. Because the big inflection point for how doctors became an organized professional class in America was lobbying law in Congress to make laws to restrict sort of people from being able to practice medicine that weren't following certain guidelines. And then the people that were making the guidelines were often, it was state medical boards that were often associated with or appointed by people from the state AMA chapters. So this created like a corporate and private, junction of power.
Right.
So I think today is focusing more about medical education and because a lot of this really started to come into full force in the 1870s through like the 1910s. I think that's
right.
And then the hospital development is a big thing there too. But in this chapter, or in the last chapter of 3, outside of the medical profession or education stuff, I think the big take home is that I like that he is discussing some of the tangible discoveries that actually were a big reason for why medicine became more of a prestigious profession. It's like the public health measures, cholera toxin, or antitoxins rather, vaccinations and hygiene, just regular public hygiene and aseptic technique, the surgical sort of innovations that occurred, the diagnostic innovations that occurred, people using x-rays and the stethoscope and everything. And
the statistic about the number of deaths following surgery in the early 1800s is crazy.
Yes, anesthesia, another important development. Yeah,
it just sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, or 46 maybe even. It's could you imagine? I mean, you would basically just get really drunk a lot of the time. You would get the patients drunk. So there was still a type of anesthesia, I suppose. But yeah, I couldn't imagine going through an amputation completely sober.
I mean, even drunk.
Anyway,
I was going to say, can you imagine going through an amputation and waking up with the pain and a hangover?
You'd have to be drunk for a few weeks after the fact, too. Anyway, that was a brief thing, and we can get into the hospital stuff. But yeah, what do you guys think?
I like that he brings it back to authority and how it develops. So the end of chapter 3, he kind of wraps it up, bringing it back to how authority is developed and how the development of authority is really sort of one of the most crucial aspects to the rise of sort of like the professional medical class. Because that actually brings it back to what we were talking about 2 weeks ago when Brother X was on. And I like that he brings Milton Friedman into it too. That's nice.
I mean, I agree. The focus on authority, and yes, exactly. That goes back to the introduction where he's discussing cultural and social authority. And I mean,
because he says there's the bit that I highlighted. He says science may improve the efficacy and productivity of a profession without making it rich or revered. And I think that's an important point, that things can improve. You can improve technique. You can improve all sorts of things without like the profession becoming this huge socially revered and important touchstone in society. But then he goes on to say knowledge must be transformed into authority, and authority into market power before the gains from scientific advance can be privately appropriated? How do you pronounce that?
Appropriated?
It's appropriated. Sorry.
That's all good.
My highlight is like too dark. It's hard to read. Is appropriated by a profession. On the other hand, monopolistic practices alone are insufficient explanation. Many occupants seek monopolistic power to cite the impulse is no explanation of why some succeed and others fail.
Yeah, and I think just sort of tying in, Mr. X, your summary from last week about sort of turning this, I think authority and increased economic power into lobbying. I've got a spot highlighted here where they're just talking about how as the AMA kind of took over control of medicine, people were advertising only through the AMA journal, and that was a huge source of revenue for them. And he wraps that up by saying, once again, cultural authority is being converted into economic power and effective political organization. And then jumping ahead to where he's summing up the chapter, to to what you were saying, Antushka, just, he's bringing home the point that it's not just about sort of having a monopoly over the field, but it is this established authority. And he says, if the medical profession were merely a monopolistic guild, its position would be much less secure than it is. The basis of its high income and status, as I've argued all along, is its authority, which arises from lay deference and institutionalized forms of dependence.
Yep.
And, so there were a lot of forces in creating the institutionalized forms of dependence, but part of it is the lobbying that the AMA was doing, as well as just sort of the, changes to society with industrialization and, reliance on specialists for services, et cetera, that he's gone over.
Yeah, I think those two last points are especially crucial. Like I guess they call it alienation in Marxist thought of just as industrial society progresses, you become kind of siloed more and more independent. Or I don't know if they talk about the dependency, but you become kind of isolated. I guess maybe I'm talking about two different things, though, because I'm also thinking, yeah, the logical thing that happens in urbanization is that you become dependent on people for more things. This is the point that he made in the first chapter, from the farm where you would treat everything and call a doctor for just the serious things.
Right.
Now you go to a doctor for everything, and you're more dependent on the doctor, which leads to increased lay authority, as they say. But yeah, it is interesting though, because I mean, especially because to remind people, it's like in the early 19th century. Again, physicians were not; they were kind of a lowly class. They were lower than lawyers and business, finance, and everything like that. So it is still just kind of intriguing how it became such a respected, and honestly, like, you drive around the medical districts of any large city, and they're like the cathedrals of today. In terms of the buildings and the infrastructure. I mean, that's the first thing I think that I first really noticed coming from music, like going from music to the medical field, is just being reminded how much more money is invested into that. It's like it's crazy. Whereas, back in the day, it would be the cathedrals were the big sort of places. And I do think it's from that the deal with science. It's medicine just leaned way into science, and I think as society progressed, that's what gave it a lot of the authority. Right. Is, I think, just tangible outcomes. That's why I keep coming back to that.
Right, because there's a lot of fields that have leaned into science in a lot of ways. I mean, like music production, everything. I mean, now all music is recorded digitally and it's all mastered. Like, there's so much, science and technology that goes into that.
The scientific method, I should say.
I see.
I should say that. Yeah. Because yes, everything uses science now and technology that's come from science, but it's the scientific method. And that's the thing, is, again, just germ theory just really revolutionized medicine. And it was scientific application in medicine to allow us to isolate all of these things. So even if there weren't treatments, the treatments were in a lot of cases prophylactic, right? But
he outlines like a lot of those gains throughout the end of the 19th century, particularly in public hygiene, which aided in a lot of prevention, but also then in diagnostic technology. And that, like he's arguing, like you're saying, just that really added to the like kind of evidence for the authority of the medical profession.
And I think I'm emphasizing this because I think it is something that we forget sometimes today, because there have been blunders in the medical field and science field recently. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, one point he makes that I thought was really interesting, because like you said, it still isn't like 100% accurate. But like he's making the point of diphtheria antitoxin, and talking about how it was effective. He says it, reduced the case fatality rate from 50 to 31%, which is, significant, but it's, you know, but in terms of like sort of solidifying the authority of a physician, he says, the value of diphtheria antitoxin depended on early and accurate diagnosis.
Right.
So it's not even just the antitoxin; it's that you need somebody who can actually diagnose diphtheria. And so, medical expertise in a case might mean the difference between life and death. For understanding the growth of medical authority, it may be irrelevant that doctors could not cure most sore throats. Informed patients would still want a physician to take a look at a child's sore throat, even if the probability of diphtheria was only small, just because that was the only chance of diagnosing it and then treating it. And so you take, 100 kids with a sore throat to a doctor, and maybe only 2 of them have diphtheria, but that's the difference then between saving them or not,
Right. Yeah, no, exactly. So the diagnostic component was an important thing. And actually, as I think I may have briefly mentioned, in the beginning, it was the only development, really. There was a point where they're like, we don't have a lot of treatments somewhere in like the 1860s. And it came later in immunology and in a lot of those developments, antibiotics, et cetera. But it did just start mostly as just better diagnostics, which was on the back of science. It's the stethoscope. You needed an understanding of sound and how amplification works before you could make a stethoscope. You needed to know what an X-ray was before you could take an X-ray. Right. You needed to, whatever, the list goes on. But there is the other important part in Chapter 3, which is discussing medical education, which is the other sort of important, I think, thing for centralizing medicine, is there was this force that was, again, guided largely by the AMA that was pushing for standardization of medical schools to better keep out outside schools, outside medical people, I suppose. And
riffraff, I believe.
Riffraff. So they talk about the Flexner Report. I mean, that was the big report at the turn of the 20th century. Abraham's Flexner, I think, or Flexner, who was the brother, actually, interestingly, I think, of the guy who set up the Rockefeller Institute in Chicago. Or, I mean, in New York City, maybe. Anyway, doesn't matter.
Carnegie.
Flexner worked for Carnegie.
Yeah.
But his brother, I think, worked for Rockefeller.
For Rockefeller? Okay.
It doesn't really matter. But anyway, it's a little bit of a side thing. Now I'm just going to look up Flexner Rockefeller. Yeah, Simon Flexner. Yeah, director of Rockefeller Institute.
Nice.
Anyway, so he was important. He basically made this scathing report of medical education at the turn of the 20th century that was kind of inspired by a not public report that the AMA had done themselves of medical schools, right? And it essentially, yeah.
Not only was their report not public, but like I think you guys were discussing this last week, just that there was, part of their code of ethics in the AMA was not publicly disagreeing with each other. And so it was like specifically because of that, right? The AMA didn't want to come out and basically put all these schools on notice for how terrible they were. And so did they specifically commission Carnegie or?
I have the quote right here. So as you just said, professional ethics forbade physicians from taking up cudgels against each other in public. It would have been unseemly for the AMA to violate its own code. Instead, the AMA Council invited an outside group, the Carnegie Foundation, for the Advancement of Teaching, to conduct a similar investigation. The foundation agreed and chose for the task a young educator, Abraham Flexner, who had taken a bachelor's degree at Johns Hopkins and whose brother, Simon, was a protege of William Welch and president of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. So, and so the big things that...
and just while you're looking, I just thought it was kind of funny how they got there, right? So the AMA doesn't want to publish this, but they obviously want the info out. So they, gets an outside, which, actually isn't a bad thing to have an outside investigation.
Right.
But because it was Carnegie, they said like all these schools are, they hear the name Carnegie, they think money and endowment, and they're
And so they
opening
let
their
him in.
doors in ways
Exactly.
that maybe like somebody else wouldn't have had access, and he's seeing everything.
Exactly.
Pretty funny.
Just tearing them down.
Yeah, no, it's pretty crazy. No, that's a good point. I forgot about that. So yeah, his main recommendations was to follow the Hopkins model for how to and the Hopkins model was like, it's essentially the model that we have today. It's like 2 years of study, preclinicals, and then you have 2 years in the clinic. Mm-hmm. And you also have you have laboratory labs and stuff like that. You have science applications now.
Just
and
lectures.
that was what's that?
Not just lectures.
Exactly. Yeah. So that was a big reform as well. And then the other one was to close schools that don't meet a certain standard. And because the assertion was, so the first class schools had to be strengthened on the model of Johns Hopkins. So he split them into 3 classes. And a few from the middle ranks had to be raised to that high standard. The remainder, the great majority of schools, ought to be extinguished. America was oversupplied with badly practitioners. It could do with fewer but better doctors. And so they said, but what this did, the closing of medical schools greatly enhanced the market position of private physicians, but Flexner himself had an aristocratic disdain for things commercial. And precisely because of this high-minded, unmercenary spirit, his report more successfully legitimated the profession's interest in limiting the number of medical schools and the supply of physicians than anything the AMA might have put on its own. And, I mean, Brother X and I were talking about, I mean, do you want to explain kind of the outcome of that?
Yeah, I mean, when they're walking through all these changes to medical education, and I mean, not just standardization of it, but, the fact that, like, some schools, it was basically 2 years of training of just lectures, lectures by, God knows who, right? Like it could be anybody.
Right.
Could be Antushka.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah, right. Antushka.
I was just telling people.
This man can talk, all right? No, but like you read about all these changes, and I think there's a lot of good that came out of it, but it talks about sort of how far it went, and they allude at one point that maybe like Flexner felt like the over uniformity of the medical education was maybe stifling creative work, but there's also just the homogenization of the doctor class because medical school became a lot more expensive, not only because as you had basically schools limiting the number of doctors and the number of schools becoming more limited.
Antushka, is his mic going out for you? Your mic's
bad.
going out.
My mic is going out?
Yeah,
Yeah.
there it is. That's better.
It is a Zoom thing, I wonder?
I don't know. All right, take 2. Are we going to do the whole thing again?
Yeah, let's
do we
it all
remember
again.
our lines, guys?
Yeah. So we were talking about Flexner, right?
Yes.
Flexner. So the good and the bad. So the trickle down
doctornomics. That's essentially what he thought would happen.
Yes.
Do you want to
That
talk
was my
about it?
line.
Yes.
I think we already talked about it.
Yeah, that was your line. Yeah.
Yep.
So my thought on it that I was about to say when Mr. X stopped us to fix technical things. That camera is so distracting. You're looking down and it's peering down. It looks like your camera is trying to see what you're reading.
Yeah, it should. Yeah, I turned on the AI component, so now it's tracking me.
Now it's curious. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's, last week we were talking about the economics of it, and most of these things are driven sort of at the root economically. I wonder if there is just an economic problem with anything expensive is sort of by virtue of the fact that it's expensive going to be difficult to access in rural. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. This is great because we don't put out video, so there's just completely
No context.
out of context laughter.
Yeah, sorry. It's just focusing on me.
Right, yes. Mr. X's
Sorry.
camera is not behaving.
Okay, I'll turn it off. This is very distracting.
Yeah.
Apologies. No, don't sleep.
Now his camera's gone.
Okay, let me just. Okay.
I think the most exciting part of this episode is really the technical difficulties.
Yeah,
And all this medical stuff is this boring stuff in
Flexner,
between.
blah blah blah. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's sort of anything expensive is going to be hard to access, and anything cheap will tend towards low quality, probably.
Yes. Yes. Well, and that's a. I mean, I guess we should. It lost me. You need to. Yeah. Okay. I thought I turned it off. That was a point that was made in chapter 4, and I suppose we should probably talk about that, or else we'll. Or we can at least weave it in. Is that?
Right.
I mean, so the development of the hospital, that's essentially what chapter 4 was talking about, and it was kind of laying out what like Foucault said, is it started largely from the almshouses and whatnot in the medieval era,
Right.
as just charity works for the poor. And then in the 19th century, it became used by physicians. And then in the 20th century, it became sort of overrun with administrators. But what happened as the physicians came into power is that they privatized a lot. They privatized it.
Right.
And at first, the first hospitals actually didn't charge any patients, and this was a whole issue. And this is why general practitioners in the rural communities didn't like hospitals, because they would send somebody to a hospital, and then the hospital would treat them for free, and they lost a patient. And so what happened is, as the profession consolidated, you would have these physicians at hospitals that would start charging for patients, which was something that was never done. But this was allowed because the physicians were taking over the hospitals, where the trustees and the philanthropists who had sort of the wealthy people who had donated to run it were no longer running the hospital. So there was a general privatization of this, which I think did lead to basically better
Right.
treatment and more. And this is why you had private rooms versus, you would have all the patients in just one room. And so, yeah, you had a luxurization.
Luxurization.
Yeah.
Well, quality is expensive. I think that's the problem is that's almost always true.
Yes. Yeah, and there was a hospital price crisis at the turn of the 20th century, from the 1800s to the 1900s, where you had they literally had to become commercial because they were bankrupt, because the price per patient was so much more, the price per bed.
Right.
And what helped this happen was the surgeons. The surgeons came and made hospitals profitable with the procedures. And that is basically still the case today.
Right.
Which is why the surgeons are the big shots. Because it's true. I mean, the modern hospital probably wouldn't be able to exist as a commercial entity without the surgical component.
Right. I don't know if I mentioned it last week. Out of curiosity, I looked up the average salary of an orthopedic surgeon. I think it was $550,000.
Yeah,
I mean,
this is why
I don't know anybody, or I don't know of people who make that much money in my world.
Well,
They don't exist, Antushka.
They don't exist.
yeah. Well,
They're not real people.
The comedians. I don't know.
The comedian. Yeah, but I don't know any of those comedians.
So I didn't read the hospital chapter.
Wow.
One thing I'm curious about, does he talk at all about, like, I don't know exactly if they'd even be distinguished this way, but like hospitals that are attached to a medical school versus independent ones? Because it sounded like when he is talking about the medical education, the Johns Hopkins Hospital was started through, that endowment that was left. And so that, I don't know, but and so it sounded like part of the establishment of some of these hospitals and medical schools, especially as the standards got raised, they weren't profitable. But if you have, maybe at some point higher price surgeries supporting them, or the endowment of a school, but the pure economic model that existed wasn't sufficient to support it, is what it sounded like. I don't know if he goes more into that.
He does. I mean, that's a great point. That's exactly it. Is there were kind of like three. Here, let me actually find the spot. There were three main ways that the hospital became able to survive, because it was at kind of a crossroads at the turn of the century, and one of them was charge more, to the patients. One of them was public, obviously funds, and that was a big thing that happened. And then one of them was private endowments, or get associated with a school. Mm-hmm. And because then you have all this cheap labor essentially from also with the medical staff. And that was another big thing, is that when it was charitable, when hospitals were charitable, it's true though that the doctors didn't get paid. Nobody got paid. It was, you were paid in experience and like room and board, basically, in the early 19th and to mid 19th century. Solution to hospital cost crisis: increased patient payment. So 65% of the revenues were from patients in, I think, what year was this? This was end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, somewhere around then. And then 17.7% was government funded, 3.6% endowment, 5.7% donations, and 7.8% other. So, yeah. But at some other point, he does talk about how, you had a lot of them becoming associated with universities. Yeah. So, when they talk about the rise of the hospital, I mean, a lot of things happened that made it sort of, I guess, the central hub for medicine, which it really is now. It's like you choose medical schools based off of the hospitals that you would rotate in. And that's the big thing that makes a medical school prestigious. And they weren't always the central hub of medical education, though, in the early 19th century, and it became such because of two main things: hygiene. So they became just, you wouldn't die going in and having like an operation because there was better hygiene, and actually nurses were instrumental in this, and more specifically women. Because I guess, let's see, where is it? It's like in 1872 or something, there was a group of women in New York City who basically petitioned to have, I think, nursing staff and a regularization of like the hygiene of a hospital.
Right. Yep.
And then the other thing was aseptic technique, in surgery. That was another thing. So now it became not a death sentence to send somebody to a hospital, because that's kind of what it was before these things in the late 19th century. And you could now actually go in and be cured. And I think, I can't even remember, Brother X, maybe we were talking about this off mic, but you would have surgeons actually were kind of instrumental for the hospitals, because they were even making their own hospitals. Like, you would have surgeons who would just sort of set up medical boarding houses, basically, and just do procedures, and you have that even today. And so that's another reason why it's like, in some ways, the surgeons helped create the hospital. And you used to do home surgeries, and now aseptic technique and all the hygiene practices made it much easier to just centralize everything, have an operating room that everybody goes to and whatnot. So, and then, of course, you also had the infrastructure things, which we've talked about previously, where, it's like you need an X-ray now, and you can't just wheel around X-ray machines and stuff to everybody's house. Though I know you would like us to, Antushka.
I would, yeah, right. That's my dream world. X-ray machines on the go.
It was the State Charities Aid Association, who in 1872 formed a committee to monitor the conduct of public hospitals and almshouses. And this was a group of wealthy women in New York. The New Hygienic Order.
Right.
So, okay, I cede the floor.
So how many of these things, for instance, like the Flexner stuff we were talking about with talking about closing down schools that didn't meet certain standards, or this new board that is sort of looking into the like cleanliness, hygiene practices of hospitals. What authority do they have behind them? So the AMA sort of contracts this outside organization to look into something, and then there's recommendations made of school standards. What authority is there to close schools that don't meet those standards?
Well, a lot of it, I think, in the beginning before laws, because eventually it became laws, right?
Right.
But before that, it was kind of like
when he was doing that, were there laws? Did the AMA have power within the state to close a school, or was it more like you just can't be certified with us or something?
Well, it became that way.
Right.
So it started as if you were part of the AMA, you had to do certain things. Mm-hmm. And so that's what it became, just a social contract in a sense. And then as more physicians, you would then be recognized as a good physician. Right. And so I think it's just from that, it becomes a social thing. Like, oh, I as an AMA physician wouldn't recommend you go to this school. Right. Or we don't, the AMA doesn't certify this school. So yeah, you can see a physician that went there, but just know that they're not AMA certified. Right. So it became as just like a social, I don't know what the word would be other than contract of a signal, a social signal. Then this became legalized through the increased power that from lobbying and everything like that. Right. That's my conception. I don't know, brother.
And then is it the same thing with this
hospitals,
the board,
Yeah, I think so. Oh, with the State Charities Aid Association?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think it's like,
because I'm sure that now there are all sorts of regulations hospitals have to follow.
Well, it's like, look at today. So today, USA News and Reports is they rank all of the medical schools, but they're a private organization. And so you can ask, like, who the hell cares what they think? But everybody does. So they've just found themselves.
Yeah, I'm not saying who cares. I'm saying how are we getting from, there's a step that I'm missing, and maybe maybe he says it and I missed it or glossed over it. But there's a step of a private board or organization doing rankings or giving scores or grades or something to the government closing things down, saying no, you may not do it. Not you can't do it, or not you can choose to do it or not, but you actually cannot do it or may not.
So I think part of the intermediary step was some of those places becoming less economically viable and just shutting down on their own. Students aren't going there anymore. I think that's part of the step.
Right.
And then, at some point the AMA lobbying for actual legislation.
I think that's it. It's just as the AMA grew wealthier and could afford to lobby, and also just their own distinguished nature. I mean, I'm sure then they have a office in DC and stuff like that.
Right.
And all the states, obviously, state capitals. Right. Or at least the chapters. Back in the day, it might not be the same. I think it still is kind of the same. But anyway, it doesn't matter. But yeah, it's just, I think through just a slow, I see what you're saying is at what point do you say, do they say this is a law now? But I think the step that you're missing is just people pushing for that law to be made. Which happens as...
Because, like, U.S. News ranks universities, and, they say Harvard's the best university in the country kind of a thing.
Right.
Who knows if they're right or not? That's sort of a judgment call. They have a way of tracking it. But there isn't then a next step. that the government goes down and shuts down every school below 100 or something like that.
But there
is an accreditation system.
There could be, and there's nothing that says that couldn't happen if a group decided that was powerful enough and had the authority to do that, decided that.
Right.
It hasn't happened, and I don't think it's going to happen, but I think that's the point, is that...
Right. I mean, I think the closest thing to that in general education is probably the accreditation system.
Yes. Yeah. And that's taken... I'm sure it's not... Maybe it's not consciously taken into account, but I'm sure it's understood. I mean, everybody looks at these rankings.
Right.
Sorry. Well, and I guess... So in the Flexner report... when he's talking about the three kind of classes of schools, the bottom one, it was his recommendation that they be closed. Right. Were any schools actually closed, though? Like,
yes. Yeah, I mean, that was the whole point, is that...
closed by the AMA, though, like to Antushka's point.
Well, this is where it becomes plausibly deniable. It's like, you can't say the AMA closed them. But the AMA essentially closed them
My point is Antushka's asking a specific question, to my understanding, about what's the mechanism to actually close these schools. Right. I don't know that there was one, is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't think the AMA went and closed them. Right. I don't know that the government went and closed them either.
Yes.
I think the changing
closed them.
Yes, the changing market forces closed them.
Yes.
So not being accredited made students not want to go there. I know in addition it mentioned like there were some of these schools that were I can't remember the word he used, but effectively like for-profit institutions. Mm-hmm. And the profit model no longer worked for them anymore. Right. Mm-hmm. Because they didn't have, they couldn't afford the labs, they couldn't afford to build a hospital, all that kind of stuff. And so they closed.
Right. So so that's actually it.
That's what it is it wasn't that there was a law or an organization that came and said you have to shut down.
It's regulations, in a sense, regularizing it.
Well, it wasn't a regulation either. It was a standard that was created.
Well, yes, right. Exactly. Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
So there are regulations now, though.
Yes, there are now.
So at a certain point, it moved from, like Flexner's recommendations, which become accepted in the AMA, all the way to now, where actually there's a lot of legal barriers to starting a medical school.
Actually, this is the other thing. I don't know if there's a specific law that says you can't be a medical school if you don't have, like, labs. There might be, but I think it's more likely that there's a law that says you have to be accredited by a body, and then the body sets all those specifics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, and, I'm sure it's similar. When I was looking into law schools this fall, there's any number of places that I could go get a law degree. Mm-hmm. They're not all accredited by the ABA, where I could then take a state, the bar exam and become a licensed lawyer.
Right. Right.
Where I'm not even allowed to take the exam unless I have a degree from specific institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So it's not a law that's in place, but it is it's an accreditation body that kind of holds control.
Right.
By setting a standard that people have to meet.
Nice. Yeah. And the progress. I mean, you probably like the whole point that he kept making. The progressives essentially pushed this through, and also the difference between the progressives and the Jacksonians. Did you catch that? That was an interesting comparison. Yeah. How they both the progressives and the Jacksonians from the 1820s or whatever had science. They embraced science, but they differed in authority in how they embraced authority. I think that was the main point, if I recall. I don't even remember where it is. So
it was at the end of chapter 3.
Yeah,
I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, here it is. Okay. Both the Jacksonians and the progressives esteemed science, but they understood it in different ways. The Jacksonians saw science as knowledge that could be widely and easily diffused, while the progressives were reconciled to its complexity and inaccessibility. So, For the professions, the contrast between the two eras was striking. In the Jacksonian era, professional monopolies were assailed in the same spirit as business monopolies. In the progressive period, reformers and muckrakers crusading against business interests held up professional authority as a model of public disinterestedness. Mm-hmm. Thought you might like that, Andy.
I do like that, yeah.
I knew it.
Disinterestedness.
Yeah.
Yes.
Disinterestedness.
Disinterestedness.
What a word.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, so I mean, I thought that was interesting because that's an undercurrent that he keeps kind of talking about, is how the progressives were also instrumental in this kind of monopolization of medicine by the allopaths,
right?
And yeah, because that was something we talked about last episode. Is the whole differences in the specialties too. You still had homeopaths and eclectic physicians,
right.
And then you had osteopaths, obviously cropping up in the 1890s, and chiropractors.
Right.
But there was a lot more diversity that you could choose from. But somehow we've gotten to this point where it really is just allopath and DOs, of course, osteopaths, have a monopoly on
right. And nobody even
medicine.
says those words. It's just medical school. It's just taken as a given that that's what medicine is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even the DOs. I mean, I was just talking to my friend yesterday who went to DO school, and I mean, he doesn't do any of the osteopathic stuff. It's just allopathic medicine, basically, and then you throw in a few osteopathic things just for the sake of saying it is. But it's all very silly, anyway. Yeah.
It's all very silly.
Well,
there
we
are
can
still
get to this.
homeopathic folks out there, and you can get homeopathic remedies with like 100 times distilled or something.
Yeah.
Whatever that funny thing they do is, where you eat a sugar pill.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know if we have time to get into this now, but this is kind of the central thing that I wanted to come back to with this book, is that I would like it to be sparking the discussion of whether there should be something, some force to push against the monopolization of medicine, I suppose. Like, it's good to have regulation of medicine, obviously, because you don't want quackery, right? But has it, if it gets to a point where we feel like we're getting sicker with the current state, the way things are, and people aren't being treated efficiently with all the great technology that we have, then we have to be asking questions.
What's wrong?
The problem with the monopoly is that you can't see if there's quackery, because if there's only one way of doing it, you can't compare it to anything. Right.
And but I keep emphasizing the good things that science with medicine achieved.
Name
because
12.
A diphtheria, cholera, tetanus, syphilis, strep throat, to be quite frank,
Nice,
I mean, appendicitis. I mean, that used to kill. That could kill you.
Yeah,
that used to kill people.
Yeah. Well, I'm still sick.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I think that's exactly right, though. Is like that is there has to be a way of I think examining why things aren't working when they aren't, and when you do limit sort of I don't even want to just say competition, but when you limit experimentation, it makes it difficult to look at alternative methods, right?
Right. But yeah, exactly. Yes. But I guess what I want, I'm trying to say this for Antushka, is
you can say it for me.
I don't want to say it for you. You already feel this way, I think. Is being measured with the critique of modern medicine, I think.
Oh, yeah.
It's just important to remember that there are a lot of Streptococcus and Staphylococcus aureus alone, which were basically treated with antibiotics.
Right.
I mean, that saves so many lives, right?
I'm not against medicine. I'm not against. I think we texted about this a week ago or so, but I agree that I think that antibiotics are an incredibly important development in medicine in the last 150 years. I don't know.
Yeah,
early 20th century, maybe.
It's like 1920s.
Yeah. Super important. I think that there's a lot of stuff that medicine is good for. I think that there have developed incentive structures within medicine that cause it to go against what the customers of it would want or need. Mm-hmm. And I think it's related to the economic issue that we were talking about quality is inherently expensive. Mm-hmm. And there is no exact solution to this problem in any field. And in medicine, it's particularly acute because of how much the populace at the moment is relying on it.
Right. Well, and I think because for a lot of people, there's a sense that it should be accessible to everybody, mm-hmm. and you shouldn't be limited by your level of income. Mm-hmm. I don't know that everybody agrees with that, but I think that adds to it within the medical field. Like there's a sense amongst a lot of people that it should be a right to have access to health care, no matter how much it costs in actuality. Right. And so you do have people that push for like
socialized medicine.
Yeah, socialized medicine, right?
You commie.
No, but I'm just
I'm just joking.
I'm agreeing with Antushka though that I think it's there aren't perfect solutions for this anywhere, and it's particularly more, I think, complex in the medical mm-hmm. field just because of the nature of it.
I think that also, Brother X, I know that you weren't saying that is specifically your position. I'm not saying it is or it isn't, but
it is.
No, it's okay. But
it's kind of mine
so-called
too.
People.
It's
your
kind of
friend
mine
who told you. I have this friend who thinks this, not me. But I think that the problem is expensive is a more complicated idea than we think about. And to say that there is nothing that's too expensive, expense can mean somebody's money, it can mean somebody's life, it can mean somebody's labor. And so nothing too expensive could mean, I have the right to live in sacrifice of every other human on the planet. And I think most people probably wouldn't agree with that.
Right.
And so the idea that there's nothing too expensive, I don't think anyone actually agrees with if they dig down into it.
I don't think they do either. But I think that's missing the point if you boil it down to nothing's too expensive.
No. It's the idea of a right does sort of mean that nothing's too expensive.
I don't know. So I think I made this point mm-hmm. once on the podcast where I don't find a lot of value in mm-hmm. boiling too many scenarios down to their absurd conclusion. And I think that's what mm-hmm. by saying, if you consider it a right, that means that you consider nothing to be too expensive, and that's absurd.
But I think it can actually go back to something more normal, i.e., argument for taxation implicitly means that you believe that you have a right to some of my money, meaning that you have a right to some of my labor. And I think that the point in boiling it down to that is not to say that's absurd. It's to say that is the actual implication of that. That's the practical implication.
Well, I don't think that's the practical implication, though. I think you're wrong about that. I think that's the impractical implication.
But that's what it is in practice. When I'm saying practical.
No. I don't think it is, though. Uh-huh. It's not saying that I have a right to your money or your labor. Uh-huh. Me saying that I believe in taxation is saying that if we all want to live in a society, I think we must give up some of our rights and our labors. I
agree with that last
that's
point.
How
that
I
second
look
point
at
you said, I agree with you.
And so it's not me saying that I have a right to your money and your labor.
The aggregate. aggregate.
Exactly.
Everyone has a right to my money and my labor.
It's the aggregate, which is not him. It's
But
everybody.
I think when you say everybody, I think it in practicality means effectively nobody. And so that's where I think we have a difference. It's like, when you look at a drop of water going into the ocean, you don't see that drop of water anymore.
Right.
Whoa.
And
No, I agree with you. I also agree that cooperation is necessary in a functioning society. It's important.
And I also I want to put it out there that I don't think I have any answers to anything either. So I want to put that up front.
You're also talking into a lightsaber, so.
I'm talking into a lightsaber, and Mr. X's camera is following him.
Yeah.
This is the most distracting podcast of all time.
Sorry. But it's fun.
It's fun.
But,
Yeah.
to get back to sort of medicine, I feel like we were on to something.
So I was trying to get somewhere with the expensive thing. And so if we don't take it all the way to sacrificing every human being on the planet, I think that there is a problem of expense and quality, and it's always going to be a trade-off. Because if you make it cheap, i.e. make it so that either the people who are getting the service don't have to pay for the service, then there is no incentive for them to use that service in a way that's even necessarily beneficial. The incentive will just be to use that service as much as they want, kind of a thing. And then there's a second question of if the customer isn't paying, who is paying? And now we have a situation where the customer isn't really paying directly anymore, and there's the whole insurance situation with doctors, and it's shooting cost up, and it also isn't clear that it's shooting quality up proportionally either.
We're definitely in that situation.
Right. And I think that is a problem that comes with alienating the price from the consumer. Mm-hmm. Not that it's a nice situation for a consumer to have to pay gazillions of dollars to a doctor. And I think that there's a problem of trade-off here, and I don't think there is a perfect solution.
No, I don't disagree with you at all. I really don't. And I don't have the answer.
Right. Yeah, I don't have the answer either, but I have an inclination, and it's something that I think I'll start pushing on more and thinking about more. But it's this idea that there needs to be a break in the monopolization of who can practice medicine.
Right.
Sure.
I think that's kind of it, and probably the same with law, to be perfectly honest.
Right.
Yeah. I think if you want to really gut it, I think that's where you got to go to.
Right. So, are you optimistic still?
I'm always you know me. I'm Mr. Joy.
Wait a minute. You're
sunshine.
Always optimistic.
Yeah, I know
You're Mr. Sunshine and Rainbows.
I don't know. I mean, maybe
now you
I'm
got
not,
that camera. You're pretty happy.
I'm pretty happy with the camera.
No, you got to work on your lighting situation now.
Yeah, I know. You're not kidding. Yeah, the lighting in here is terrible. It's really just showing my bald spot really nicely.
Yep.
No, I don't know. I'm optimistic just because, again, it's like I feel like there's a lot of excitement. Even I would rather live in interesting times than uninteresting times.
Right.
That's probably what it is, yeah.
Sure.
Because that's when all the cool stuff happens. So you can potentially be one of the people that does the cool stuff.
He wants to be a trendsetter.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
Yeah. It's all about ego.
Yeah, right.
At the end of the day.
Megalomaniac
That's what I'm
over there,
saying.
Yeah.
How about you? Are you guys optimistic?
I am an optimist. I think you know that.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Antushka, Eeyore.
I don't know. I don't know. I think it's important to be optimistic. I think that both of your optimism is laudable. However, it is difficult to see the way out that isn't dangerously destructive. And it's the same thing with most of the kind of overgrown institutions that exist in our society today. And it's like the too big to fail thing with the banks. I don't agree with bailing out the banks. However, I understand the fear of not bailing out the banks because the fallout for that is extreme. And the problem is the dismantling of the medical monopoly system would be extreme because it's not just the patients. It's also there's industries of thousands of people whose livelihoods are now in administration and insurance and nursing and all the various types of doctors. And it would rock that economy like pretty intensely.
Yeah, no, it's a huge economy.
So
I
it
think
would
yeah.
it would be very painful for a while at least.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the people I think who would end up getting hurt by it the most, of course, as with everything, would be, like the poorest people on Medicaid and stuff like that.
Right.
I mean, those are the ones who are screwed now anyway. They're no matter what happens, they're screwed.
Right.
Yeah, no, this is a perennial question.
Yep.
If I can be pretentious.
Right.
Go for it.
Perennial pretentious question. It's actually something funny because I got myself on the side of defending Mao for some reason, having a discussion with a friend about why
he did
wasn't-
make the best cheddar soup.
Well, he was saying he was a horrible leader. And I guess
a horrible leader, and you were like, no, he was pretty sweet, dude.
Well, I was saying that regardless of what you think about him ethically, he did industrialize China, and he did it very quickly, and he made it a world power.
I think from a Machiavellian perspective, he's a horrible leader.
From a Machiavellian perspective, he's a great leader.
No, Machiavelli writes about how in a prince has to be, like a dictator has to be virtuous, otherwise the society will crumble.
But
you need virtue.
Ways. He was in some ways. Like that's
Right.
the thing that gets lost in the Western propaganda is he was nice to the people in a way, right? Or at least he had them brainwashed into them thinking he was nice. Like
That sounds pretty virtuous to me, dude.
Well, I'm just saying is like this is where it gets tricky is because like
Right.
what is it? Is perception reality? In some sense, it is.
Right. Sure.
And
It's
again,
safe to do it with Mao, though. There's another guy who you can
why
make
did
the
I bring
same
this
argument
up?
about.
Hang on.
Why did you bring this up? You wanted to be pretentious for a second.
No, because we're talking about changing things.
What's
and I
your
think
question?
if you change, this is my point. If you change things fast, which is what I think Mao did,
Right.
and this is a big issue, I think, with him, and is why millions of people died under his watch. If you change things fast, then people will die. But if you change things slowly, then it's just like impetus or momentum, right?
Right.
If you have the force, but you just decrease the amount of time that you distribute the force.
Right.
And
You
so I think that's
only
the way.
arrest one farmer a day.
Yeah. But I think that's the way to do it, to reform. And quite
Slowly.
frankly, that's the way that we got to this point, is there wasn't a quick thing where like doctors like, okay, we're in charge now. And then insurance companies like, no, we're in charge. Like this was a slow burn. And so I think the way to, to do it so that,
I mean, all the changes he was outlining at the end of chapter 3, we're talking about like a, 50-year period there?
yeah, but that's longer than like
That's what
2
I'm saying.
years.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes,
It didn't
exactly.
happen
Yeah.
overnight.
Right. Whereas and we're better yet, the French, the mountain or whatever, the French Revolutionary Party was called, that was doing all the reforms in the first like year or two of the revolution. I mean, that's one of the things that created the stability is you had things were changing constantly and nobody knew what to do. And in some sense, that's honestly happening right now with medical education. They're making tests pass fail. They're making, they're changing curricula every 2 to 3 years. And they're changing the way tests are. It's very confusing.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know.
So you think more people get hurt if change happens quickly?
Definitely.
But you can have a slow change where lots of people are getting hurt and nobody's even noticing. Or you can wind up finding yourself in a situation where way more people are getting hurt and you didn't even see it coming.
Yeah. Yes. But I think it's inevitable that people will get hurt if you do it fast. That's, I guess, the difference. There's at least a way to do it slowly and,
Right.
But people don't have patience for that, too. If it's going to take more than a lifetime, I mean, most people don't have foresight beyond their own life.
Well, I mean, all the medieval cathedrals were built over the period of 400 to 600 years.
That's a great point. I mean, that's a great point. We don't really do things like that anymore.
Right.
Well, yeah, and I don't know. I'm just thinking here.
How dare you?
I think the only way to do things over a long period of time is to have a way where I think the changes so the impetus towards change is institutionalized. So, for example, the AMA working to sort of reform regulation, that would go beyond an individual,
Right.
who could pass away and then somebody's new agenda comes in. It has to be in the institution, right?
Right.
Yes. Versus an outside actor.
Right. Versus a Mao who just needs to get it done.
Yes, and Mao did get it done, but this is why. I don't think he was a good guy. And I
Listen,
just want
this
that to be very
podcast is
clear.
not about Mao.
Yeah, this podcast is not. I do not endorse Mao or his policies.
We don't talk about Mao now.
Yeah. Wow. So do we want
All right,
to?
I gotta get going.
Yeah, we gotta. Yeah, we should wrap this up. Brother X, if you gotta hop off, that's fine. We should talk about what we're gonna read next week, though, in Tushka.
Oh, yeah.
What
Are we just going to keep going? There's a lot more of this book.
I mean, I'm fine with that. Are you tired of it, though?
I'm not tired of it. Will it spark any new conversation, I guess, which I'm wondering if it won't spark tons of new conversation. Because I feel like we've kind of gone around similar ideas.
I think jumping to the end, then, it might, because
I was going to say maybe jumping ahead.
He talks about the coming corporation and stuff like that, the change that happens. I think that might be kind of interesting to read if we want to stay with it.
Sure.
Yeah, if you guys want to stay with it, I'd love to jump on again.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, cool. Are you, if we do next week, Wednesday, or really any week, I'm free. So it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, Wednesday during the day again, I could do next week.
Okay.
Cool.